Collins & Co.'s not-for-profit conference, Be Empowered Through Knowledge, is designed specifically for the not-for-profit sector. Our speakers are experts in this sector, and their practical approach provides not-for-profit board members and management with the opportunity to improve their skills and knowledge across a range of specialist topics. The conference also provides a great networking opportunity.
Please welcome Jenny.
Thank you very much. I'm wanting to know who was an accidental chair here. Anyone an accidental chair? So that was you down the front that turned up at the meeting and it was vacant for you. What about the well-planned succession? Anyone that was well-planned succession? We'll call you up to help speak at the front a little bit later. Is that all right? And what about the people in between, or the aspiring chairs? Any aspiring chairs in the room? Yeah, just one. Okay, the others just couldn't be bothered moving, I think. Is that right? Because I didn't have a few hands up there. So I guess dependent on the route that you had to get there, it's sometimes difficult at times to feel like you're really leading the team that's sitting around you at the board table, and more importantly to add value. So I've just worked out that I need to be the clicker here. Okay, to add value. Oops, I'll get better. So it's no small task to take on a team, sometimes of strangers, or probably even a bit more daunting, a group of people who are your mates or friends. Does anyone lead a team who are quite familiar to you in the room? Yeah. So sometimes that is even more daunting. But equally, I think that we forget that sometimes leading a not-for-profit organisation, especially one that has a few little challenges, can be so much more time-consuming and need a lot more energy than organisations, the $30 or $100 million organisations that are somewhat smooth sailing, unless it's the CBA, of course. So what I'm going to touch on during my presentation today is a bit about knowing your team, setting the tone and expectations for your board, and the key roles of the chair. So my presentation is based on my own experience, either having been a CEO of some charities and having to work together with the board, being on board member myself, also being chair of a number of organisations and a number of committees myself. But also seeing in my work, my everyday work, mentoring and working alongside not-for-profit organisations and their boards and their senior staff. So I believe that finding your way and knowing your team is paramount to the success of the board and your organisation, and adding that value. And there's very little times that I walk into an organisation where there is a lot of time that has been spent on bringing the team together and understanding the way everyone ticks. So I thought that I'd kick off with my tip number one, and that's a bit about team profiling. Who's done a bit of team profiling with their board before? You've probably done it more in your workplaces, I guess, but this is a fairly common profiling tool. I want to see whether you recognise yourself, and also maybe the board member that drives you a bit nuts every now and then. See if you can recognise them in this profile. Are you precise? Are you powerful, peaceful, or playful? Or do you drive each other insane? You drive yourself insane. I sometimes do that. I'm sometimes the opposite, so I drive myself insane. How about that? Do you classify yourself as a thinker, a doer, observer, or talker? Are you starting to get a feel for where you fit the majority of the time? Do you ask how? Do you ask why? When or who? These are the sorts of things that these profiles start to talk about and think about and ask. And what about, are you thoughtful, are you detailed and you're tidy? Is that anyone here? It's certainly not me. No? No, someone agrees who I've worked with down the back. Are you assertive, decisive and productive? Easygoing, diplomatic or patient? Enthusiastic, talker or funny? They're usually the people who we hear before they hit the room. And they're usually the ones that run into the board meeting and explaining why it's taken them so long and why they're late and all of their papers flying everywhere. Who's that here? No one's willing to admit any of these. And what about when you're put under a bit of pressure? What are you like then? Are you cautious and stubborn? No decisions without infinite amount of detail? Are you controlling and directive and impatient and sometimes feel like you're a bit cold or others call you cold? All right, who is a precise? Who identifies most with the precise? Yeah, a couple in the room. What about the powerfuls? Yep. The peacefuls? There's a few unwilling to commit, I can feel that. And what about the playfuls? Yep. One of the things in terms of a board mix is that it's important to have all of those. And while if you're a playful person, having someone who's constantly talking about detail might not be your idea of a fun meeting. It's important to know where they're coming from. And without understanding a little bit about the styles of your board, it's pretty difficult to work out, well, how do you use those strengths and those biases, particularly in decision making, to detail, or the biases to risk taking that some of the others are more aligned to. It's really difficult to have a great conversation and make sure that the conversation keeps moving and is conducted well so everyone feels like they have their time and their space in a board meeting. Also thinking about these styles, the top ones are task-oriented and the bottom ones are people-oriented. So if you're making decisions about redundancies or employing people or changing the focus of your organisation, people are going to be thinking about, well, how does this affect our people? We want to make sure that we bring them along with them. And the people up the top are just about the goals. Okay? So think about those people that sit in your boardroom, and particularly those ones that probably maybe not your best mate on the board, and why their particular style might not align to yours and where that might cause friction. So that's an important thing to understand as a chair. But likewise, if we've got too many powerful people in the room, there's going to be juggling and egos. Okay? If we've got too many of these precise people, we're not going to get to a decision in a hurry. So do take the time to understand where your boards sit and how they profile, so that you're able to talk through those in a way that is really respectful. Because when people need a little bit more detail to make a decision, you as a chair needs to know how to bring that to the table without disenfranchising the rest of your board. Is your greatest fear never being able to leave the chair? Who's been in a chair for more than 20 years here? Anyone? No? None of those? Sometimes this is the reason why people don't step up at the chair. Anyone willing to offer what their greatest fear is, being a chairperson? For an aspiring board member or chair, what would be your greatest fear about taking on the board? Can you think? Not doing a great job, yeah? Any other greatest fears, even for those board members who have been in the seat for a while?
Sometimes not being able to keep on top or greedy or
Yeah.
countering that.
I don't know that the magistrate puts up with that anymore, though. Yeah. Yeah. And so having the time available, because as the chair, that's one of the most important extras that you got on your plate, is making sure, and especially in the not-for-profit sector, I haven't met a chair that doesn't have an attachment to the cause that they're working with. And it's an important thing to be able to spend a little bit more time as a chair. When I talk to people about their greatest fears, quite often they say, not being able to draw, to draw everyone to a conclusion when they're in a bit of a tussle. I did a bit of work the other day with a group that, by nature of the type of organisation they were, they had a large board, and they decided that they wanted to rotate the position of the chair. And so I started to talk to them about some of the things that they were a bit concerned about. And by the time we got to the end of that 5-minute conversation, there was one person who had repeated themselves and their point of view 3 times. There were 2 people I observed who were trying to talk who didn't get the opportunity. And there was one person who, out of that 5 minutes, took 1 minute, and that was in a room of 13. Okay, so it's not an equitable sharing of information that they had. Yet they described themselves right at the start as people who were very respectful. They listened to each other's point of view. They were enthusiastic and they had robust discussions. But I had to point out to them that at all times during that conversation, they were talking over each other and they still hadn't got anywhere near close to making a decision. And that started to then tease out, well, actually, that's one of the reasons I don't want to be chair. Because we're here with a bunch of people that we know and we respect, and trying to draw them in and pull them to account is one of the things that they were most fearful of. And that is quite common for a chair, is trying to work out when you need to stop the conversation, and particularly if it's a circular conversation. Interestingly, there was a young woman from Belgium amongst the group, and she said, well, in Belgium what we do is, because there's no use adding noise to noise, she said what we do is to make a big action, like pressing on a big red button in the middle of the table, and that stops the conversation. And there was a lot of eye rolling, a lot of huffing and puffing, and the only real alternative was a squeaking duck, which wasn't really very satisfactory to most of the people in the room. And so we created some guidelines and some rules. And because everyone gets on well without rules and policies and procedures until we don't. And so it's great to set expectations really clearly. And that's difficult if you're taking over from a chair who is long respected but doesn't necessarily run effective board meetings. So how do you make those meetings a bit more effective? So my tip number 2 is setting the tone and expectations. So regardless of the team you're in, whether it's a family or a sports team or a board, it's about setting the tone for success. All teams should have an established culture, but when there's not, it's reliant on the chair to help to create that. Just calling on my history as in sporting teams was one of the first places I really realised the importance of setting expectations and making sure that you're holding people around you to account for their actions. When I first made the Australian team, I was on the team for 14 years. And when I first joined the team as a young athlete, there was no clarity about my role in the team. There was no establishment of a culture and the responsibilities of the members of the team, or for that matter, the coaches and the management staff. There were conflicts of interest, and by that I mean there was players who were there who were very focused on getting the most out of it for themselves. And you might think, well, that's high performance, isn't it? But not when you're in a team. It's really important that you maximise your own efforts, but making sure that you still bring those efforts to the team. There was no team chemistry, and there was no time spent establishing the rapport and the development of the team itself. And this resulted from a coach who wasn't particularly skilled and I guess if you look at the coach and the captain of a sports team, it's really about the person who leads the way and establishes those expectations. So the coach wasn't skilled in drawing the team together and establishing those expectations. And there was a new captain on the team who hadn't been told how to lead. The result was failure. Failure for the team. Failure for our country. A new coach arrived on the scene and they asked 3 players, random players, to present at a team meeting that night and describe what it was like or what your responsibilities were when you were representing your country and what it meant to be an Australian softball player. I was one of those randomly picked athletes, and given that the three of us got together and worked out, well, actually, we don't have anything like that. There's nothing that we've got where we've set expectations and we know what's required of us. And so we set about starting to make some team rules and expectations, because when a whole bunch of players had left the team, and this happens on boards, players leave the team and all of a sudden you don't have that transition of knowledge, and you'll know what that's like if there's not good succession planning, and that's where I'm going to call on you later, sir, at the back. You're well successioned. So a couple of things that we set. No part of our uniform was ever allowed to be on the floor. And what's the board analogy for that? Don't disrespect your organisation, and don't allow others to let that occur either. No players should leave the team bus area until the entire unpacking had been completed. And what's the board analogy there? We're all in this together through the dirty work and the hard stuff. Everyone's in it together. No one leaves alone. And all players are responsible for lifting the group and showing leadership. And the board analogy, and particularly for the chair, is the chair is only the first among equals. We're all leaders there. So that transition was quite an interesting one, in that it lifted the team from suddenly not really knowing what it meant to be a representative of the team, same as when you're on the board, to really knowing what our business was about and having clear expectations set. You'll have that all of the time, board members moving in and out, and so it's important that the chair sets the expectation that everyone knows what their responsibilities are and they transition that information to all of the rest of the board members. Sometimes it's the chair that gets out of line. Has it ever been you? Other chairs in the room? No, never. And so everyone is responsible for making sure that we're holding each other to account. How do you change the culture when it's ingrained, though? You've just taken over a board where the culture is ingrained. And this leads to the role of the chair and the importance that that plays in the success of the overall organisation and the retention of staff. In particular, NFP chairs carry a lot of responsibility in this area. So the chair and the CEO relations, it's important that they're respectful and robust discussions, creating a team and making other board members feel like they haven't missed half the conversation. So if you and the CEO are working that closely together, that the rest of the board members are missing some of the information that can disenfranchise some board members. So it's important that there's enough degree of separation while still ensuring that the CEO feels supported, in some cases mentored along the way. Okay? So understanding that where that friction is, because sometimes you'll need to have those robust discussions, whether it's about that the board papers are not up to scratch, whether it's about an element of the CEO's performance that needs to be addressed. Those need to be really respectful but robust discussions. And so it's hard to get that balance. But make sure that you spend time with the CEO, ensuring that they understand the expectations that the board has of their performance and where that needs to change. Okay? There's always a really good relationship there, and that's quite often the hallmark of a really outstanding organisation, where there's that respectful interchange between the board, the chair and the CEO. Effective decision making. How do you make decisions in your board meetings? I want you to reflect on how frequently decisions that were made a couple of months ago revisit the board table. I want you to reflect on how many times a decision is deferred to the next meeting because I just can't make that decision right now, I don't have enough information. And maybe also reflect on the amount of times that you do have a circular conversation and really don't get anywhere towards resolving the decision that you need to make. So decision making is a really underestimated characteristic of a high-performing board. And the reason I say that is because so many times decisions are not taken because the board members haven't really socialised the way they accept risk. Okay? If we understand our biases and where we're all coming from, if we understand the appetite that we have for risk and where those differences are, then it helps us with effective decision making. But also understanding that there's times where you want real collaboration in your decisions, and they're those really large decisions that you're making about your organisations. Sometimes you want decision made with a minimum of fuss. And sometimes the decision's so small or has been socialised to enough degree that can be a circular resolution. But there's not lots of time, from my experience, spent in talking about the way you make decisions and when you need to be fully collaborative and come to a consensus on a decision versus let's just majority vote so we can move on because this is just not important enough. Who here does, on their agenda, talk about the way we're going to make a decision? No? Sometimes that's a really useful thing to do. Just like in your board papers, it's good to have for noting, for decision making, for discussion. So it's clear why the board members are coming together and what is the expectation out of that discussion. But if you add, when it comes to the decision making, that it is about a robust discussion and therefore we're going to have a collaborative decision making process, then it's a different type of discussion and a different amount of time that we're going to set on the agenda to have that discussion and make that decision. Quite often when we come to making decisions and people say, no, let's just park that to next meeting, does it ever get resolved? Quite often not, because quite often that's the way people state their objection. They can see that the decision's going to be made by the team and they just don't like it. So their way is, I haven't got enough information, let's just push that to next meeting. So as a chair, you need to be really aware of those dysfunctional behaviours when it comes to decision making. And that's why I encourage you to think about the way and how you've discussed decision making as a team. Because quite often people don't understand the processes and when decision making, different decision making methods should be used. How about the type of information that you get that comes to the board? So the timely and quality board information. It is a big bugbear for boards about the amount of information that they're receiving, and it sounds like it's going to get more and more layered with some of the complexities with governance that we've had recently. I know that sometimes there's been whole trees in my inbox to read through. And the issue is not so much that it's a really complex decision, it's about that the board has not been clear to the CEO and to the staff the way they want the information presented. I so frequently hear from board members, oh, we get reams of paper, but it's just crap information. And that's not good enough as a board. You are responsible for understanding what you need in order to make decisions and bring the team along for the journey. So it's imperative, again, that you have those discussions. It might be an in-camera discussion that you have without the CEO or staff members about what you want presented. You might need to get the CEO or some of the staff members to have some training on how to write great board papers, because it makes the world of difference to you as a chair, as well as for the rest of the team as a board, because they can easily then distill, well, what is the problem we're being asked to look at, and what is the decision that we're being asked to make? What are some of the factors that we need to take into account, and how am I going to use my skills to put that to great effect? And the chair is the one who carries that information and gives feedback to the chair about how those things can be improved. Because we want consistency in the way we're seeing our board papers. It's very difficult to look at issues if we're getting inconsistent information presented in different ways. A question from down the back.
Oh, no, just a comment. I was preparing board papers in a large organisation, so about 1,000 staff.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Had experience preparing board papers in a large organisation with about 1,000 staff,
Yeah.
and the board papers were completely to a template. You didn't get to make up what your board paper would look like or what would be in it, because all the questions were preset, and that meant that all the board members were getting the information in the same format and could probably read their board papers a bit quicker and absorb the information, and there'd been a process obviously to set up this report template in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And thank you for those comments. It's great to have templates because you'd be surprised even by having different fonts, or you wouldn't be surprised, but even having different fonts in your board papers can sometimes be distracting for boards. And so they're the sorts of things that we need to feed back, particularly as chairs, to the CEO, so that the board can add their greatest value and to most effect for the CEO, because that's what board meetings are about. And that then brings on to the next point, is the agenda setting and the time that the chair needs to spend in working together with the CEO so that everybody gets the most out of the board meeting. Again, it is really important that the CEO gets the input that they need from the board members, but also that the board members are given the right amount of time to be able to work through issues that are important. And sometimes in crisis situation where you need to get a bit granular, have that discussion with the CEO about why more information is required than normal. So it's not okay to just expect them to understand that what level of input is required from them and their staff. Some of you won't have many staff. Who leads an organisation where there might be one or two or no staff? Very small organisations. Yeah. So this is one of the challenges of having really good input into the board meetings, because you've got your CEO sometimes changing the light globes and being the IT, as well as providing information for the board to make decisions. And so that's where it needs to be probably even more refined when you have larger amounts of resources to pour into the paperwork. But taking up your CEO's time and making sure that the agenda is set well and it's structured well, so that we get those strategic decisions and the commentary and the discussions nice and high up on the agenda. Quite frequently we're attending board meetings at the end of the day, or even if it's at the start of the day. We need to make sure that the most important aspects of the board meeting are attended to early. Okay? So quite often the CEO won't have been trained about how to present to a board. It is important that you recognise what are the standards here. We want to make sure that not everybody is reading through their report at board meetings. So the chair is the one who is summarising what it is that we want out of each and every agenda item. Okay, so the chair is a great summariser. He's able to reflect really well on the comments that are made throughout the course of the discussion to summarise. Why is that important? Because so frequently we come to a decision, but it's really unclear about what the expectation is of the CEO to move on from that decision. Okay, so we come back to the next board meeting and it hasn't been done. Oh, I didn't realise that's what you expected us to do. It's really surprising how frequently that happens. So let me just make it clear. This is a summary of the discussion, and this is what the decision has been. Is that right? So being able to reflect and reflect back to the board about what the discussion was gives them the opportunity to say, no, I'm not really comfortable with that. You didn't reflect my presentation really well. So those are the skills of a really great chair, of being able to do that. But that is helped along by making sure that you have an agenda that is set well and it's clear what the outcomes are. The clarity of the role. So some people are really unaware about what the role of the chair is. I imagine that as chairs in this room, you do have quite a few different roles that you play, particularly where you might have a bit of an operational hat. If it's a very small organisation, then more time as the chair is also spent doing some operational work. So there's not that same delineation between a strategic role that you play versus your volunteer hat where you're also doing. And that's an important thing to talk about around the board table, where you have a lot of your board members playing volunteer roles within the organisation, because there's that friction between everybody's doing as much as they possibly can, but that sometimes means that Jenny is doing twice as much as Kerry is doing. So have a discussion about that when you do have some operational roles, because the reality is when we have a crisis or we have small organisations, we need to sometimes dip into a more granular outlook on the organisation and what's happening within the operations, so that we can make sure we get back to plain sailing. So the chair plays an important role in clarifying whether we have our board hat on or when we then step aside and we have our volunteer hat on as well. And we're playing operational roles within the organisation, because sometimes the staff don't understand that that is the case for some small organisations. So what is your role as the chair? It's setting the agenda. It's making sure that the harmony of the board is established. It's making sure that all of the board members are accountable for the actions that they've put down to do. It's also managing the performance of the organisation and the board. So some of you might have nominations and governance committee, and that plays a strong role in making sure that there's succession planning, that there's performance management, but sometimes that's not a situation for all boards. And if that's the case, then it's the chair's role to make sure that that's really clear on what roles you're playing. So lastly, the role of the chair is to create trust, engagement and openness. It's not possible to create opportunities where that occurs is where there's no eye rolling and people feel safe. I'm sure that a number of you in the room have seen this piece of vision, but I did want to show it to you. And I want you to watch the behaviour of the people in the room. Not surprisingly, this organisation's now out of business. Hope none of you were in the room. It doesn't look like any of you were. I'm not sure how I play this. Has anyone seen this video?
Are you there?
No, that's what I was saying, Brendan.
We can't be a proxy.
No, it can't be a proxy.
It's a board meeting.
It can't be a proxy, you can listen in.
He can be an observer.
Well, someone's going to have to talk about Ching's proposal from Ching's point of view, aren't they?
Yeah, well, and what's his name? John Stewart is.
Who's he acting for?
Right.
Ching or the company?
King.
You sure?
Well,
Why is the company paying him?
well, the alternative, of course, would be to be.
We'll get to it, Bill. I'm just saying.
90 million shares.
Can we just get on with things rather than all this nitpicking goes on in this bloody board? It's just pathetic, frankly. A lot of you. You're all the same. Now, let's get
Just a minute, before you say that.
Look, I'm chair of the meeting. You won't interrupt the
I'm
meeting.
going to interrupt.
You're not.
And you're going to listen.
No, why?
What are you going to do? Stand up and hit me? Or?
Well, I might, yes. Why?
Beg your pardon?
I beg your pardon?
You want to get John Stewart in
I
to
don't
talk
want to get
about
John
this?
Stewart in at the moment. I'm saying we're lucky to be having this meeting because apparently I got a note from you saying you wanted to cancel it because there were a number of conflicts in diaries.
Yeah.
Who were the conflicts?
You were one of them?
Me? Where was I? When did
You
I
were
say?
away. You
I
gave
was
us
not
no-
away.
Well, you didn't. That's not what I was told.
Who told you that?
You did.
I told you that I couldn't come to the board meeting. When did I tell you that?
No, last meeting.
No, I didn't.
It doesn't matter now.
I guess it would be fair to say, Brendan, he's acting for Newsat, but he has been, and acting for Newsat, has been actively involved with Chin and his advisors.
Yeah, I understand that. I just asked who he was acting for. When I asked that question, the chairman jumps down my throat. Actually, you can't see this. Stands up as if to sort of intimidate me while I'm sitting here. Stands up, starts shaking, and tells me to stop.
Nonsense. Just stop, would you please?
To stop.
It's pathetic.
Ask me to stop.
Children.
Ask me to stop asking nitpicking questions.
Yes.
What do you mean I'm the worst? No, I won't forget it. What do you mean I'm the worst? What are you saying I'm the worst for? Take control of yourself.
Morning, Michael.
As I said, they're no longer in business. But these are some of the most respected people in our business world. Well, they were. And that's one of the things that quite often we forget, is that what would it look like if this was filmed, if this board meeting was filmed? And when I'm chairing, I like to think that and keep it at the back of my mind, because as a chair, making sure that people are not disrespected in that way, that while yes, people, and I sit on a number of not-for-profit boards, and therefore we do get emotional and we are engaged with the content matter of which we're talking about. But that behaviour is never acceptable. But it's clear that it's been allowed to happen for a long period of time. And the dismissive nature of the chair has led that to happening. And we know the saying, the standard that you walk past is the standard you accept. And that's where the tone from the chair is so important. And setting those expectations. While it might be uncomfortable when you first start in the chair, especially if that's not what you've been used to around the board table, it's a good practice to be in. It's a good practice to create a social environment where all of you can start to feel comfortable with each other rather than just around the board table. I worked in a session the other day, and I noted that two of the board members were sitting in a cafe before the session, and when they got into the session, they were talking about how long it had taken to get there, and they said, "Oh, we came before the traffic, and we had breakfast together." In the 1 year that they had been on the board together, they had never had a personal conversation. So to understand from the chair's perspective where that new board member was coming from, what their experiences were in starting on that board, and what value they felt that they were bringing to that board meeting, they'd all gone unstated until that year later when they sat together just because they were attending an occasion together. And they talked about how important it was that they now understood where each other were coming from. But that was, for me, a failing of that chair. So it was a chair and a board member, that they hadn't made the effort to see each other outside of the boardroom, or even in a strategic, you might have a strategic planning meeting or at some time together, but making sure that you do organise that time where all of the board are together in some sort of social setting, because it makes the world of difference when you need to really bunker down and put your arms around each other because there's a lot of stuff that's hit the fan. Just like this. You can't imagine that was going to be a very pleasant conversation. But to be able to have those discussions and people to really talk about their fears for the organisation without being criticised or you being overly dramatic is a really important thing, and the chair is paramount in allowing those behaviours to roll out. So, are you still going to put your hand up to be the chair? Yep, good on you. So it is about when you're thinking about being the chair or how to improve behaviours. It is about thinking through, well, what does success look like for this group? What do we need to change to make sure that everyone's feeling comfortable and that everyone understands what is expected of them as a board member? And the chair is responsible for carrying those responsibilities out and making sure that you have a good induction as a board member and that everyone is clear about the way we work together as a board. Hopefully that's been enlightening in some way, shape or form for any of you, but we've got a bit of time, I think, for some questions, if anyone has some, or if anyone wants to offer some words of advice.
Thanks, Jenny. Ian Corcoran is my name. I guess a couple of the roles that I've taken on, I've never gone into a role without an exit strategy. So if you adopt AICD, good governance, you think 3, 3 and 3. A chair's role really is probably 3 years. I'm about to step into a role, I'm in the middle of another role, but the key thing was I knew where I was going to be in 3 years' time, and I'm not there forever. And the organisation isn't about me, it's about the organisation. So you put the organisation first, you go, what's best for the organisation? And if that's the best thing for the organisation, to rotate through the chair every 3 years, then that's the best thing. And that's where your role sits. It can be threatening, sitting there amongst people that one, you want to perform, 2, you don't want to embarrass yourself, 3, you don't want anarchy. You want it to go smoothly. Got to remember sometimes you're amongst friends, and that's really important. So instead of being the one that's there to dictate, control, whatever, engage your board in making the decisions, and often that's a good way of embracing what people can bring to the organisation. Your role is to get value out of people, not to be the one that determines what should or shouldn't happen all the time. So it works for me. A bit of governance training also helps. So company directors course, all that sort of stuff is really important. And I made a point in the last session, there's a lot of governance organisations out there. That's the best thing a director can do, is either have your company pay for your training or undertake some training yourself. Hope that makes a difference.
Yeah. Thanks for your comments, Ian. And I totally agree with you that it's great to have that succession plan. On all boards that I sit on, I do have that nominations committee in some way, shape or form to make sure that there's that orderly succession, because the removal of the chair can be the detriment of an organisation. But if it's orderly succession, as you've described, then it's not as painful. There's not that key person risk that sits within the organisation. We, a board that I'm sitting on at the moment, we have a transition plan for the chair, who has been around for a long period of time, and in fact started back and hasn't, it's been an interrupted tenure, but started back when the organisation was started. And so it's been a long time, and the value that that person still brings is immense. But she said that it's enough. So we've recognised that, and we've got a plan to transition her out in a year. So we've already started to talk to other members of the board about where they would be positioned. But the important thing is putting the best interests of the organisation at the forefront of your mind. And that's sometimes challenging for people, because we know sometimes we have founders who are the chairs, and it's really difficult for them to let go sometimes. Sometimes we have people who are there for different reasons. And so understanding that and teasing that out, and recognising when that's happening so that that can be really well managed is part of that succession planning. Yep. No other questions? No. Thank you, everyone, and good luck on the throne to all of you.
Thank you, Jenny.